First question, why are you running for the Ossining School Board of Education? Christine and Aaron, please keep time.
I wrote out all my answers because I want to make sure I get the best use of my time here. I first became engaged in the school board business back when my first daughter, a current second grader, started school. Even before then, I advocated for fair funding in ways that I could with young children by making phone calls, writing letters, etc. In the midst of the pandemic, like many of us, I'm sure I found myself reassessing my priorities and examining my time spent as a reflection of my values. Though I have always been happy to volunteer for PTA or my children's nursery school, among other things, I found that sewing and donating cloth masks gave me a sense of purpose at a time when everything else happening in the world seemed senseless. I went on to assess what else I could do to be of value of my local community. In my regular attendance at board meetings, I noticed a lack of teacher voice on the school board and thought it would be a good fit with my teaching experience and particularly my background in humanistic and multicultural education. I first ran last year and lost. Shortly after last year's school board election, I was invited to apply to teach part-time at the middle school where I had taught for 1 year before I gave birth to my second daughter. Given that I have not been elected, I decided the best way to make use of myself in service of my community was to work directly with our students. I'm running for school board because I'm still committed to serving the community, and I still feel like my background and strengths are well suited to filling the gaps and experience on the school board.
Thank you. What's the achievement gap in Ossining, and how do you plan to fix it?
Thanks. So when people refer to the achievement gap, they're referring to the persistent trend of students of color performing worse in schools than their peers. This is reflected in grades and standardized tests and graduation rates and tends to be consistent across whatever way you choose to assess students. Closing the achievement gap has been an important priority for the Ossining School District for decades. So if it were an easy task, it would already be done, but it's not. The middle school specifically is on the TSI list with the state. And this means that a subset of students are not meeting the goals in parity with their peers. And in our district, the population that lands us on this list is our Black students. Some of the things that we do to try to reduce the achievement gap benefits all of our students in the same way a rising tide lifts all ships. Our district utilizes RTI, Response to Intervention Strategies, which is a tiered system of academic support tailored to meet the academic needs of each student. We also have implemented MTSS, multi-tiered support systems, which is a broader, more holistic way to scaffold our services to meet student needs that includes regular screenings and database checkups. We have implemented the My Brother's Keeper program, which specifically focuses on boys of color at the middle and high school level. And I have personally seen the benefits that this brotherhood has had on my students. Similarly, we know that giving students play-based education experiences and connecting with families early on can have lasting impacts. We are ahead of a lot of our other districts already simply by offering a grant-funded pre-K program, but we go beyond this with our Ossining Basics program, which you may see in partnership with the public library. Refocusing our discipline philosophy, helps reduce suspensions, which are punitive and do little in the way to deter repeat behavior. Our students are good people who do well when they have the opportunity to do well. Children make the kinds of choices that lead to suspensions when they have an unmet need or underdeveloped skill. Restorative justice practices and other strategies that are less punitive and focus on a growth mindset will help us in our goal towards a more equitable.
10 seconds.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. In a recent board meeting, it was brought up that a resolution passed in 2020 to put equity on each agenda fell short of that goal this school year. In fact, out of 24 meetings, it has only been on the agenda 7 times and 2 times in this calendar year. How would you, as a board member, address this with the superintendent and board president that set the agenda? Do you think equity should be placed on each agenda? Why or why not? Christine.
All right. So equity has to be an essential element of our work as school board members and should be at the heart of every discussion that we have. Every single student in our school district deserves a high quality public education, no matter what. Though the resolution was passed in 2020, a concern about the structure of the more recent board meeting agendas was mentioned publicly for the first time this past week. It was my understanding based on that meeting that the superintendent was asking the board for more clarity about their expectations in the agenda setting. Do we need to discuss equity as its own agenda item if it will already be an integral part of our discussion as it relates to other scheduled items? What's most important to me is that equity remain the lens through which we write policy, develop our budget, and fine-tune our curriculum. I would not mind a little more structure around equity updates. Perhaps we could do a monthly update on a theme that's set in advance. For example, in April, ahead of when most of our hiring takes place, we would be able to talk about our initiatives to hire more teachers and staff who reflect the population of our students. But in July, after receiving our standardized test scores, it may make more sense to digest those through the lens of equity at that point. Perhaps it makes more sense to simply highlight in our meetings how what we are discussing fulfills our duty to consider equity. My attitude is flexible on this. I'm not opposed to breaking out our equity discussions into separate agenda items if that makes things more digestible to our school board and community. To me, the specific structure of how we integrate equity into our discussion is secondary to the fact that we discuss it in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you. There are some community members that believe that the Ossining School District is currently in a better fiscal position than it's been in years due to fair funding, and that they should receive a decrease in the tax levy. What do you think about that? What should the district do with its surplus? Do you believe there are ways our children can benefit from this surplus? Christine.
Thanks. So the district is in a much better fiscal position than years past. I have been a teacher whose job would be cut if budget proposals with high tax levies have failed, and I've seen cuts to the bone proposed. If our budget question of the day is how do we spend all this money, we're in excellent shape. In my ideal world, I think I would have kept the tax cap at 0% for this year. Our foundation aid is not yet fully funded, and I've seen the state pull the rug out from under schools too many times to trust that full restoration will happen until I see the check hit the account. The superintendent proposed a budget that adds over 20 teaching positions, expands dual language program, expands ENL services to our students, expands after school activities, and provides more course offerings to our high school students, to name a few. Restoring and expanding upon what Ossining students have gone without while our schools were systemically underfunded by the state. The superintendent proposes with a 0% tax levy increase. The school board, with some access to financial modeling that I simply don't have, supported these initiatives, but asked that the school district spend down some of its reserves in order to give back to the community. One of the biggest hurdles I see to providing our students with the best possible education is facility challenges. We're crunched for space in nearly every building. Students' schedules and course offerings are affected by the space available. A music teacher coming to a kindergarten classroom to teach music is not going to teach as effectively as a music teacher with her own room that contains unencumbered space for students to move and access to instruments. Students should not be receiving pull-out services in hallways. In June, the inside of our buildings offer no relief from the hot temperatures, and with an increase of availability in summer school offerings, it only makes sense to modernize our buildings to include air conditioning. All this being said, while I would have supported a 0% tax levy increase, I will not lose sleep over a negative 0.5% tax levy increase because I know that we are expanding our programming and making appropriate financial investments in our students while remaining fair to our taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you. Question number 5. What is your position on the critical race theory curriculum? Would you be opposed or unopposed to this curriculum being in the Ossining Union Free School District? Why or why not? Christine Mangiamele.
All right, so let's be clear on what CRT is and what it isn't so we can address the underlying concerns. CRT is a legal theory taught to prospective lawyers about how our systems and society can perpetuate the status quo and examining who benefits from that status quo. There is no textbook company that a school district would go to and say, I'd like to see the copy of the CRT version of this. It just doesn't exist. It doesn't work that way. What I do think is appropriate to learn is how to think critically about why we learn what we learn, and students are naturally curious about this as it applies to every subject. I think that some of the worry about CRT being taught in schools is that teachers may be imposing their own beliefs on students, and I have never seen that happen. Good teaching has always been about encouraging students to think and grow individually and independently in order to fulfill their own potential and find success, however they define it. I think it's important that we understand that American history is not a monolith and that different perspectives only enrich our ability to understand one another. The immigrant story is the American story. Black history is American history. And the inclusion of these perspectives does not detract from our understanding of American history, but enriches it. No single culture deserves to be at the center of the dominant historical narrative. What we do have, and what is important to have in order to educate the whole child, is culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching takes into account that students come to the classroom with their own values, customs, and cultures and seeks to leverage those as assets to improve learning outcomes. This is a data-driven approach where the goal is for students to feel empowered in their own education, regardless of their culture. What this looks like in practice, in part, is students seeing themselves in their stories reflected in the books they read, creating classroom environments where students are comfortable expressing themselves and maintaining high expectations for all students, regardless of their backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you. In the PTA debate, you mentioned your experience is what sets you apart from the rest of the existing school board. However, the superintendent is an educator, and some would say that would serve the teacher perspective aside from teaching in the classroom recently. We're also aware that this year, your second campaign, the OTA, Ossining Teachers Association, endorsed 2 candidates for the first time ever, with you being one of them. There are only 2 seats and both teachers run as individuals. Maureen Bosenhill is also a teacher, but has a unique edge different from you and experience working with our most vulnerable population of students with special education needs. What then sets you apart from your colleague, Maureen Bosenhill, for a seat at the BOE table?
Thank you. So first, let me draw the line between myself and the superintendent. The superintendent's role is pretty far removed from the day-to-day work of teaching. Teachers are supervised by their building level administrators, and then he supervises those administrators. He, of course, as part of his job, is open to listening to the concerns of teachers, but he does not currently have that perspective and hasn't for a while. Furthermore, and more importantly, his role as it relates to the school board is very different than that of a board member. One of the few responsibilities the board is tasked with explicitly is hiring, firing, and evaluating the superintendent. And I think it's really important that during that process specifically, we have a teacher voice. Maureen and I offer differing perspectives because the vantage point of an administrator is different than that of a teacher. In your question, you say that Maureen was, quote, working with our most vulnerable population, end quote. And while I have no doubt that Maureen would best me at writing IEPs and making determinations about who qualifies for which services, the actual work of implementing what's on the IEP is the work of the teachers and therapists. Working with those students. Now, I'm not going to say I have the same level of expertise at implementing 504 and IEP plans as some of our absolutely spectacular special education teachers, but I would like it to be known that I have worked with students who are in self-contained classes and many, many students with accommodations. When it is time for someone in Maureen's position to reassess what is appropriate for supports, she will go to teachers like me to receive feedback. I'm not saying that Maureen wouldn't add a valuable perspective, and I don't know Maureen personally at all, but my perspective is unique in that I'm in a position to experience how the curriculum initiatives we hear so much about at the board meetings would actually impact the classroom experience for the students that I pour a whole lot of energy into building relationships with. Thanks.
Thank you.